Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. It's Tuesday, September 17th, and in Columbus, Ohio right now, it's the thick of college football season, but we've recruited Adam Jardy of the Columbus Dispatch, who covers men's basketball, to talk with us today about what was a tumultuous last season for the Ohio State program, coaching change, and then a lot of promise going into this season with a really nice transfer portal class that the Buckeyes have landed. Also going to touch on just the Big Ten expansion and what the league's going to look like this season with 18 teams. Welcome to the show, Adam. Good to talk to you on this Tuesday morning.
Yeah, Alex, I appreciate you having me on. And for what I understand, it's football season for you guys there too. I've heard reports of Indiana having a pretty good team this year, so that's got to be fun.
Yeah, I get asked still if I'm ever going to cover football, and even if Indiana was in the college football playoff, I wouldn't dip into those waters. But it's been good to see a lot of fan support and optimism about this football season so far. Indiana obviously 3-0. They got a game coming up this weekend against Charlotte, so should move to 4-0, and nice start for Curt Cignetti in his first season. So fun game to watch over the weekend with them going out to UCLA and emerging victorious. We were talking a little bit before I hit record just about Chris Holtmann and his time in Columbus. A couple years into his tenure, it looked like he might be the best hire of that cycle. When Archie Miller was hired at Indiana, Brad Underwood got off to a slow start at Illinois, and Holtmann had figured things out pretty quickly, it seemed like, in Columbus, and obviously had some really strong finishes in the Big Ten. Never really, I don't think, got to where fans wanted in terms of the NCAA tournament. And then last season, things really unraveled. That Indiana game at home, a moment that stood out to a lot of people that was kind of, I don't want to say the nail in the coffin, because maybe it was coming anyway, but I think maybe that was just a moment that a lot of people looked at and thought, this isn't going to work out. And you've watched this up close, and you've obviously covered Holtmann for a long time. How surprised were you at just how things went sideways so quickly? And now he's at DePaul, and Ohio State's got a new coach in Jake Diebler.
Yeah, it's interesting how quickly it did fall off, because you look at those first 5 years, and they made the tournament every year, and they were they never won a trophy. They came close a couple of times. That first year, 15-3 in the Big Ten, but you don't get a share of the championship. And Penn State, beat you 3 times that year, and so that put a weird sort of coda on a year that he was Big Ten Coach of the Year, and they had the Big Ten Player of the Year. And then he had inherited such a decimated roster. You go back the last couple of years of the Thad Matta era, and they had entire recruiting classes transfer out. And this is before transfer portal really kicked in, and so there was a real big hole on the roster that he had to patch. And it felt like getting back to the tournament in 2019, they were able to do that. And then COVID hits. They had a really good team that year, and you get through that, and you get to 2021. And to me, this is where it all kind of changed, because they're playing through the pandemic, and they get to the Big Ten tournament, and they come just short of beating Illinois in the championship game of the Big Ten tournament there at Lucas Oil, and come off of that. And it was, took a lot out of them, really emotional, physical run through the tournament there. They ultimately lose in overtime, and then they go lose to Oral Roberts. And it just all kind of unraveled from there. They decided to go young and build the roster through, really talented players that they felt would be multi-year players who brought a lot to the table, but that happened to come in an era where college basketball is older than it's ever been. And so taking those lumps with those young players just didn't pay off in the way that they expected it that it would. And so that's how you end up with a roster these last 2 years that they go 5-15 in 2023, and we're really struggling in 2024, 23 and 24 until they make that move. And to your point about the Indiana game last season, that was the proverbial nail in the coffin. To lose that lead at home and take that loss, that was what set the wheels in motion, to where a week later, they lose at Wisconsin on a Tuesday night, and then Wednesday morning he's gone. So it's weird, because it feels like it kind of happened quickly, but you can go back and pinpoint some milestones where it's like, okay, this thing is trending in the wrong direction, and then it all came to a head there on Valentine's Day this year.
When Diebler took over on an interim basis, was it with an understanding to him that this would be an audition, or did most people think, or was he under the impression that this was going to be just a temporary thing and they were going to go outside the family and to make a hire? And how surprised, I guess, were you that he was able to have such success down the stretch last year and ultimately earn the job?
Yeah, I don't know that he was much of a candidate right away. I mean, I think when you have a new athletic director coming in and, a chance to really kind of make a mark on a program, and you have an associate head coach who has been the head recruiter on every player on the roster, and the roster hasn't worked. I think there was a fair amount of skepticism. Like, why would you then promote from within? But then the way he energized the program and the way he got those guys to rally and the connections he has in Ohio, he was well connected with the main collective that supports the program. There was a lot of things kind of working in his favor, and then they kept winning, and so it made it a situation where, yeah, he played it, or they played their way into making Jake a legitimate candidate for the job. And I really felt like going into that Big Ten tournament in Minneapolis that he had a chance to solidify it. And I know there were other jobs that were going to be out there for him, and there were other positions that were interested in interviewing him. I don't know if right off the bat he thought, hey, Ohio State's going to be a realistic job for me, but it's a dream job for him. And so I would say, yeah, he always wanted to be the head coach at Ohio State at some point. I think as it went on a little bit more, it became clear that he had a real chance. And then that's when things started to get interesting.
How much of a factor, excuse me, do you think the uncertainty just of the candidate pool outside of looking internally played a factor in him getting the job? Because you look at what happened at some of these other marquee jobs. Obviously, Michigan gets Dusty May, and he a lot of people looked at him as kind of the main target for a lot of these schools during this coaching carousel season. But Kentucky has to hire Mark Pope, which obviously he's an alum, but not really a proven head coach in terms of NCAA tournament success. Louisville, take some swings at some bigger names, and ultimately they land on Pat Kelsey, who is another coach who doesn't have a ton of NCAA tournament success. Do you think that played a part at all either in terms of just looking at the landscape as a whole and maybe saying a lot of these coaches that are at these jobs now, let's say Scott Drew from Baylor 10, 15 years ago, you might have thought you could go and get Scott Drew from Baylor, but now he's entrenched there. He's kind of built his own thing. He has the resources he needs, and there's not really much reason for him to jump to another job.
Yeah, it was a fascinating job market, honestly, because you start going around and you look at like some of the candidates that they were interested in. Like, look at a Lamont Paris, and look at, he ultimately gets an extension and a raise to stay. And you look at certainly a Dusty May, and you look at some of the other guys that they were in on and they were talking to. It was fascinating to me because there was not a slam dunk, like go out and get this one person. And to me, it then started to get to a point where, do you want to try, once the likes of Jay Wright and all those guys turn you down, how much do you want to spend for someone who isn't a guarantee when you have a guy in-house who would run through a brick wall for the program and who is beloved by his team and by, the people that support the program? And so it became a really interesting coaching search in that regard, because I felt like as you got closer to the end and we had a couple of candidates that were known, I could poke a hole in every one of them. So ultimately, like, what do you want to do? Do you want to take that chance on a guy who, has gotten a mid-major team, incredibly deep in the NCAA tournament, but how does that translate? I mean, obviously we all believe Dusty May is a great coach, but we'll see, how does that play out? And, like Lamont Paris came up with like a buzzer beater away from not even making the NCAA tournament the one year, I believe. And that was like the big run that kind of helped put him on the map. And so, you could really go through and pick holes make holes in a lot of these resumes. And so it was a fascinating coaching carousel to see it kind of unfold, because it does feel like the sport is kind of at an interesting time where, maybe that next generation of coaches is up and coming right now, but you don't have that like there's not that one proven commodity. Go out and get this one guy. And if there is that guy, he probably ain't leaving the job he's got. So that was one thing that was really interesting, talking to fans throughout the process and trying to get a feel for who would you go out and get. There really was not a consensus in the fan base, but I don't think that hiring Diebler really made anybody all that angry. I think there was a lot of people that got it.
Yeah, I'll never forget this last spring when Mike DeCourcy, who obviously writes for the Sporting News and does a lot of good work for BTN on TV.
Oh, yeah.
Immediately after the Kentucky job opened, he put out his list of candidates and he had Mark Pope at the top, and Kentucky fans gave him all kinds of grief for that list. And obviously they thought they were going to get Danny Hurley or Jay Wright or Billy Donovan. And ultimately they land on Pope. It just kind of, to me, that was, I looked at the whole situation and just kind of thought to myself, wow, if this is kind of where Kentucky has to land, then and they're, obviously one of the biggest fish in the whole land, and they have to go and get a coach who's never won an NCAA tournament game. Things feel a little bit different just in terms of who you can go get. So that was definitely a moment that stood out to me. I want to talk a little bit about the Ohio State roster turnover. Obviously had some key guys leave in terms of Roddy Gale going to Michigan. I believe Okpara went down to Tennessee. He played a ton of minutes last year. They had some other guys leave as well. But it feels like they did a pretty good job in terms of identifying guys in the portal, getting some guys maybe with a little upside who maybe underperformed last year as freshmen, and Aaron Bradshaw and Sean Stewart coming in from Duke. Overall, do you think this roster is better top to bottom than it was last season? And of those guys that they lost, maybe who were the most impactful losses that guys that maybe they didn't want to leave?
I mean, I think the two guys that you would hope would stay would have been Roddy Gale and Felix Okpara. I mean, those are two guys, like I said, they committed to going young a couple of years ago, and they really built through that class of Felix Okpara, Bruce Thornton, Roddy Gale, and Bryce Sensabaugh, funnily enough. And so, you try to project like having those guys as a core group together for a couple of years. Like this would really kind of be the year where maybe you'd start to see some of that payoff, all those guys being juniors. Obviously, Sensabaugh's in the NBA, but like losing Felix and replacing him with Bradshaw, I mean, I think you have more upside offensively. I think Aaron Bradshaw can stretch the floor in some ways. They're counting on him to stretch the floor in some ways that Felix had not yet demonstrated the ability to do. I don't think Bradshaw is as far along defensively as Okpara was. So I think there's, you're making a bit of a trade-off there. And Ohio State did plan on playing them together. There was a real belief because Bradshaw committed, and then within like a week, Okpara transferred out. And, it's pretty fair to say that one had at least a strong thing to do with the other one there. So, the initial thought was you'd have those guys together, but you don't. And so you kind of replacing one really tall, lanky, athletic dude with another one. Losing. I've been a big upside Roddy Gale person. Like I believe he had a significant wrist injury like all last season that significantly held back his ability to shoot. So you look at he's a much better shooter than what he showed over the course of the season. I think he's going to be potential significant breakout player this year. I think he's going to do a lot for Dusty May there. So certainly, you wouldn't on paper wanted to have lost either of those guys. Then you bring in, like you said, Bradshaw and Sean Stewart, basically 5-star guys who just didn't really do much at Blue Bloods as freshmen. So you're banking on that development as sophomores and that they can be those players that they were projected to be out of high school. But I think the addition of a guy like Michi Johnson, I think, is also pretty significant because, he has a 4-year, essentially at this point, body of work that, you kind of know what you're getting with him. But, he's such an Ohio guy coming back home and capable of sliding into that backcourt and taking on a significant role. Ohio State, the last couple of years, trotting out, starting freshmen and sophomores in that backcourt. You pair a Michi Johnson with a Bruce Thornton, and that's a pretty good place to start with a roster.
How do Thornton and Johnson work together in the backcourt? Michi seems a little bit different than Roddy Gale, more of a guy that might want the ball in his hands more often than Gale did.
Yeah, that's going to be a really fascinating thing to watch because I do think I think there's more similarity between Thornton and Johnson than there was between Thornton and Gale. And so you're not exactly replacing Roddy with the exact same type of guard. And so one of the things I talked to Bruce Thornton about this summer, he was running a camp here in Central Ohio, and he talked to me about how like he's going to play a little bit more off the ball. He's been practicing like different 3-point shots because he's expecting maybe not to be dribble shoot, more catch and shoot type of situations. They do plan on, count the number of times we've heard a Big Ten team say this in the last 100 years. They plan on playing faster. So assuming that
they will in November and December.
So, I think having two guys like that who can both handle the ball at a high level and have played, in really tough environments and stuff, I think they can mesh together in that way, and it'll take some of the pressure off of Thornton, who really has had so much of the keys to the offense in his hands these last 2 years. So I think it frees up Bruce to maybe just feel a little bit less pressure potentially. But I am interested because, like I said, I do think there's sort of some skill overlap between those two, and I'm interested to see this fall, like how they differentiate, how they complement each other without being redundant.
Looking at their numbers, looking at the numbers of the players on the roster from last season, one thing that seems like a question mark to me is the 3-point shooting from the perimeter. Do you feel like they have enough in terms of being able to space the floor and get guys open looks? And do they have guys that can knock down those open looks?
Yeah, that to me is the biggest question with this team. And certainly when they brought in Jamison Battle last year, they thought he would be, a good 3-point shooter. But the way he just kind of exploded last year and really put himself, on the NBA radar, honestly, the way he shot the ball last year, that was a little bit more than I think they expected. So I have to remind myself, you're not just going to go out and get a Jamison Battle in the portal every year, like those guys. And we saw, like Kobe Bray from Dayton, Ohio State was kicking the tires there and was interested in him, but obviously he ends up going to Kentucky. So shooting can be difficult to go out and acquire. I'm curious to see, because I think they have guys in this team that are capable, but they need kind of everybody to get like 5% better. If you shot 28% last year, can you shoot 33 this year? If you shot 33, can you shoot 38? And I think a big thing for that's going to be like Bruce Thornton is a guy that has proven he can be a quality shooter, but he's not been the most efficient. And that's been a big thing he's talked about, is like trying to get better at that, taking fewer and making more. Michi Johnson has essentially shot the same percentage for the last couple of years. Do you see a little bit of an uptick there as a 5th-year guy, playing a homecoming year in Ohio? Can that bump up a percentage, a couple points? I think they have candidates on this team who can shoot. I think overall the collective shooting might be slightly better, but you're not going to – I don't see a Jamison Battle on this roster right now. I don't see a guy who's going to go out there and shoot 45% or whatever it was that he shot last year. It's the biggest question mark, because if this team can't shoot, then it gets clogged in the paint really quickly. And if it gets clogged in the paint really quickly, I don't know how Air Bradshaw works down there going through a Big Ten gauntlet. I don't know how Sean Stewart works in a clogged paint. Like, I have a lot of question marks about what that looks like if they're not able to push the tempo, or if they're not able to at least be proficient from 3 as a team.
The other question I had just in general on them in terms of their depth, it seems like they have a pretty solid 8 guys that you look at in terms of being proven, or guys who have played some minutes. Looking at, this is assuming that they're going to start Thornton and Johnson, likely Micah Parrish, correct me if I'm wrong, Stewart and Bradshaw. And
probably Stewart, maybe Devin Royal.
Okay. And then you've also got the Kansas State transfer, Glover and Evan Mahaffey coming back. Beyond that, I don't know in terms of what's returning, being proven. Does it feel like they're going to have some young guys, freshmen, play a little bit, or is there somebody else maybe I'm forgetting that gives them a little bit more depth?
Well, I'm interested. The 2 freshmen that they have, Colin White is an Ohio kid, was not extensively recruited, I would say, but like has by all accounts universally impressed himself on the roster this summer. Like, he has really made an impact, and is a guy that if if I thought he was maybe going to play 3 minutes a game as a freshman, maybe he's finding a role to play 8 to 10. Like, I think he's kind of forcing his name into the conversation a little bit. The other freshman, Junie Mobley, is a shooter, like 24/7. I think it was. It's either 24/7 or ESPN named him the best sniper in the class. Okay. So, that's a guy that he's going to play in that backcourt, and he's going to have some opportunities to shoot. He has incredible range. I think he could be a really intriguing guy that impacts the depth there a little bit. The big, literally, question I suppose that I have right now is they added a Croatian center, Ivan Njegovan, which by the time the season is over, I'll probably have the last name down. But he's a legit like 7'1", 260. And everyone that I've talked to has raved about he's a skilled big man. I don't know what that looks like, and I don't know what to project for him, but I think that could be a guy. He's got a Big Ten body, and you need guys like that who can give you minutes in Big Ten play. I worry about Aaron Bradshaw at 7'1", 210. I mean, he's a skinny dude. He's crazy athletic, and he can do a lot of stuff, but I wonder what that looks like going through the Big Ten gauntlet. And so I do think whether it's Ivan or they have a sophomore, Austin Parks, but one of those two is going to have to be ready to play Big Ten minutes because you need bodies to go through this league. So, I would guess the rotation goes 8, 9, maybe 10 deep, depending on how many big men find their way through. And Diebler did play the bench more last year, and that was a thing that was really interesting to me because you had some guys that you thought for sure the way the season had gone might not be coming back because they were not getting any minutes, and they did play, and that had a direct impact on Ohio State's success in the second half or in the last couple of games there under Diebler. So I do think there's a chance that the bottom of the roster, I think, is more talented than the bottom of last year's roster.
Yeah, I really liked what Royal gave him down the stretch last year. I felt like he got more of an opportunity to play and showed what he can become. It was disappointing, I guess, from probably an Ohio State perspective that Middleton left as well, because I thought long-term he could have been a guy that projected to be a really solid player. But overall, I think what they've done with the roster has been impressive. I like betting on two guys who were 5-star prospects coming out of high school that maybe didn't play as much last year, giving them more of an opportunity to get in there this year. The backcourt with Thornton and Johnson seems to be really solid. So I think Ohio State has a chance to definitely be in the mix there, anywhere from 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th in the Big Ten. There's not going to be a ton of difference when we talk about 3rd and 10th in the Big Ten this year because it's going to be even more crowded there in the middle than ever with 18 teams, which is what I wanted to talk to you about next. You've been around covering this league for quite a long time. Just the logistics of how this is going to work are fascinating to me, with all of these 4 Pac-12 teams having to come east for multiple road trips throughout the season. I'm curious to see how that impacts how these teams perform. UCLA coming to play a couple of games at, say, Rutgers and Penn State back to back. That's not an easy trip to make. It's going to be much different. But what are your general thoughts on this expansion and how it changes the league? And obviously, there's, I think, from basketball perspective, obviously this is all done in football with football in mind. But I think UCLA, USC, Oregon, and Washington are 4 pretty good basketball programs, so it should just strengthen the league in terms of quality of teams. But I also wonder, just with the diluted schedule now, with so many single plays, what the value of the regular season championship looks like down the road too, because it seems like it's a little less important the more teams you add.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think the point about winning a regular season championship, like at schools where that's been the standard, or at schools where there've been stretches where that is the standard. I mean, just from a mathematical standpoint, it's significantly more challenging than it's ever been, for all those reasons that we just lined out. When you're talking about 18 teams, like, it becomes statistically way more difficult. So I do think that that's going to impact things. I think I don't remember who it was. It might have been the CBS guys, Norlander and Parrish. It might have been them. They were doing a podcast where all this realignment stuff was going on, and they were making the point that ultimately this doesn't this doesn't necessarily add to what is more fun for you, the fan. And I thought this was a really interesting point because you are maybe accustomed to your team playing, you know, Michigan State twice a year and Wisconsin twice a year, and teams that like you've spent your entire life like watching your team play, and that you care about those games, you care about those rivalries. And now you might get them once, and it might be a road game, and you don't even get to go, you know, boo Brad Underwood in person or, you know, whatever. So I think you lose something from that aspect. And maybe that's just old man yells at cloud, and maybe that gets better in 5 years, 10 years. I certainly think that's a possibility. But I do think that adding teams that are separated by just that many miles, I don't think it's going to really help the basketball product. I think it's going to make for some more difficult games to watch at times, because no matter what you do, like that travel is going to be significant. And that's going to be a thing. Like I look forward to those stories at the end of the season when it's like, how did the West Coast teams do when they had to go to the East Coast and play on 1 day or, you know, 2 days rest, 3 days rest, whatever it is. Like, we're going to see those stories at the end of the year, and I'm sure we'll all have plenty of thoughts on that. But I do think that's going to have an impact. And honestly, like, I don't know, trying to make sense of an 18-team league in an era of unprecedented turnover, it becomes much more difficult as a fan. Like, it's just harder to keep tabs on where your team stands in relation to the other teams that you need to care about. And I just think it all adds up to a more difficult situation as a fan. I don't, adding UCLA, that's awesome. You know, they've won a ton of titles, and obviously everyone knows their credentials and things like that. The other schools, I guess they have their moments here and there. And maybe that ends up being a good thing, but it's hard for me to imagine a world where like Ohio State fans are excited that they got Washington on the schedule, and that means they only get to play Michigan once.
Right.
Like that's the reality that we're living in. And so, and I know they kept it at 20 conference games right now. I don't know if it's going to stay there. And if that goes to 22 or whatever, you know, you're taking away. Nobody likes bye games. We all get that. Like they're boring, but also like you're walking out of there as a fan after having seen your team win a game. And if the conference schedule continues to increase and you're playing more high major teams, you're going to lose more. So that's going to be less fun for the fans as well, ultimately. Yeah, I feel like you and I could probably talk about this for a couple hours.
Yeah.
But you're right. This is all done obviously with football in mind and basketball along for the ride. I don't know ultimately that adding those 4 teams does a whole lot to make the Big Ten an even better basketball conference. I think it still kind of is what it is.
Yeah, I think you're right that it becomes more challenging to win the Big Ten title. I was looking at it more from the perspective of when you have such an unbalanced schedule, are you really finding the best team? Because in a given year, one team could play, you know, three of the 4 worst teams at home only, and or on the road only, and it kind of creates an unbalanced. Like that was one thing I tried. I used to try to track was who had maybe the most favorable schedule. I don't even know how you would go about doing that now, because there's only a couple teams that you're playing a double play with, and you don't know the rosters on a year-to-year basis, so you don't even know who's going to be good. So maybe it all evens out in the end. I just think when you have 18 teams and you're only playing a 20-game schedule, it's just a lot more unbalanced than ever. The other thing I wanted to get your thought on was just this 15-team Big Ten tournament. You know, Dylan Burkhart and I have talked about this before. Not that, and every time I put this opinion out there, people always come back at me and say, well, the 16th or 17th, 18th team probably wasn't going to win the Big Ten tournament anyway. But to me, when you have a conference tournament, the idea is you get like a fresh start. That's your chance to kind of play your way in or in the season on some positive momentum. Even if you don't get to the, say, Saturday, maybe you win a couple games and it helps you get in the NIT, or it helps your program play some younger guys, get them some of that tournament experience. I just don't like the idea of having a conference tournament where you're going to gather the whole conference and then 3 teams aren't there. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Well, I mean, you can just look back 2 years ago when 5-15 Ohio State, dead in the water, gets the 13th seed in the Big Ten tournament, second worst conference record, plays on that Wednesday, and is still playing on Saturday, and actually was leading Purdue on Saturday. During the first half, and it was I want to say a 4-6 point game maybe at halftime. Like, that team did that, like, win from that first day of the tournament, and was another run away from potentially doing the unthinkable, making it to the championship game on that Sunday. So you never want to rule out Cinderella, and that's tough. Like, that's the unfortunate reality, I think, of where this is and where these conferences are when you have this many teams. Because the other flip side of that is just trying to figure out, how do you draw up an 18-team bracket that doesn't
have to add another day to the tournament, right?
So, like, realistically, what does that look like? If you're the 18th place team and you're playing on Tuesday, like, I don't like the idea, but I don't know that I have a good idea either. I just feel like my only solution to it is don't be an 18-team conference, and obviously there's no solution there. But yeah, I'm waiting for the time that, like, someone loses out on a tiebreaker, and because they lose out on the tiebreaker, they're not in the tournament, and then, like, that's going to happen before long, and we'll have all kinds of controversy with that. But yeah, I don't like it either. I feel like that's the other thing too, and this from being at the Big Ten tournament. Like, I think the Big Ten tournament is, like, the thing I like the most. I mean, I love the NCAA tournament. It's 1A and 1B, but I love, like, that first day of the Big Ten tournament when you've got 8 teams that are there, and, like, you see all the fan bases. Like, it's one of the things that makes this sport so cool. It's one of the things I love about this job so much. It's just, like, the entire Big Ten all being in one place at one time, and it's just awesome game after awesome game, hopefully. But I like the pageantry of that, and I like them all being together, and you see the Penn State fans walking near the Minnesota fans, and maybe Rutgers fans are yelling at them for what. Like, I love that stuff, and we're gonna get less of that now, and that stinks to me.
I agree wholeheartedly, Adam. Thanks for the time today. Really appreciate it. Where can everybody keep up with you in terms of social media and follow your work?
Well, you can go to dispatch.com to read all my stuff. I'm on Twitter at Adam Jardy, Instagram hoops_and_scoops, which I feel like I need to change. That used to be back when our blogs were separate on the website. That was the name of the Dispatch basketball blog, was called Hoops and Scoops. So I use that for my Instagram, and now I kind of regret that because it's a mouthful to spit out to people. But I'm on there, and actually do have a work TikTok too, which I think is CD Adam Jardy, for Columbus Dispatch Adam Jardy. But yeah, just trying to get as much stuff out to the people as I can, whatever way that I can. And my Buckeye Extra podcast as well. That's on all the podcast platforms.
Appreciate the time. Really enjoyed talking to you. Looking forward to another season of Big Ten Hoops.
Oh, absolutely. You do great work, Alex, and I love getting to catch up with you. Appreciate you having me on.
Thanks, everybody, as always, for listening to this week's episode of Podcast on the Brink. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a 5-star rating and a review over on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a 5-star rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.